Get into the material, I'd like you to indulge me for a moment and imagine the following scenario. Martin Luther King Jr. was venerated as a religious leader as well as a champion for civil rights. Imagine, though, if the situation had played out differently, with King facing a violent confrontation with the United States military. The official government story told to the rest of the world within this scenario is that a minority militant group known as African Americans had become a threat to American society as a whole and needed to be eliminated in order to maintain peace. Now imagine King at the center of this maelstrom, taking refuge inside a beloved historic church along with many of his followers during Easter services. Even though the church is filled with visitors, President Johnson will not delay his plans to thwart the rebels 1 second longer. He attacks the church, and among the dead are King and his followers, along with innocent men, women, and children. The church building is destroyed, and even the church's library has been looted of its historic treasures by government troops. Imagining this scenario is disturbing, especially in light of what we have seen related to the loss of life and destruction recently in African American churches across this nation. It is distressing, however, to learn that these events actually did take place on the other side of the world in 1984, when Indira Gandhi's forces stormed the Golden Temple at Amritsar in order to kill Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. What separates a freedom fighter from an extremist may only be a matter of who gets to write the historical accounts of events. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr. may have more in common with Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale than we realize. In his letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, King recalls how he actually was branded as an extremist by those of his time period. He states that, though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale gave a similar statement in 1984. The police have started to call us six extremists. I am considered to be the greatest extremist. My presentation will examine the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, focusing on the observed comparisons in their respective calls to action. How did cultural, societal, and religious factors play a role in the effectiveness of their respective calls to action and their goals? I've explored this connection through a survey of the writings and speeches that these men produced during the final 10 years of their lives. The central text that I used in my analysis of King's call to action was his 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, mainly because it so clearly states his plan of action in a way that could provide a model for many different types of activists working for the cause of social justice. The first step in this process calls upon the activist to assess the situation to determine if any wrongdoing has taken place. King's assessment of the problems in Birmingham allowed him to list each of the grievances of the African American community so that they could be addressed. This leads to the second step of the process, which requires bringing together the two parties involved in the dispute so that they may come to a possible solution. This phase of the process could be repeated as often as necessary if both parties agree to ongoing negotiations. It is also possible for communication to break down during this phase of the process, producing situations in which one or both parties will come to the negotiation table. This happened in King's dealings with the city government in Birmingham, and he writes that the political leaders consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation. What does an activist, or anyone for that matter, do when the government refuses to acknowledge one's pleas for those things which are considered basic rights? When negotiation breaks down, a choice must be made: acquiesce to the powers that be, or stand up to authority and possibly face risk of retaliation. King's approach favors the latter in order to expose the inequities of the world. Before this can take place, however, one must undergo a transformation of sorts, which King refers to as self-purification. This step requires the activist to cleanse oneself of the emotions of hatred and fear that can be brought to the surface when entering into a stressful confrontation. The person must be ready to endure the persecution of others without retaliating violently. King's Christian background helped to mold his ideas about sacrifice and martyrdom, and King mentally prepared himself and his followers for such sacrifice. Only after this mental preparation is complete can the individual move forward into the fourth stage of the process, direct action. King reveals that Henry David Thoreau's civil disobedience was his first intellectual contact with the theory of nonviolent resistance. And King wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail that nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that in a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. King also found a model in his call to action by studying Gandhi. King recalls in Stride Toward Freedom that as I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished, and I came to see for the first time its potency in the area of social reform. King's implementation of this four-step call to action are too numerous to mention in their entirety here. But three specific instances are worthy of note, and the first example of King's process predates his publication of the letter from Birmingham jail. Much of the language in Strive Toward Freedom bears similarity to the methods he wrote about so succinctly 5 years later. The last chapter in the book, titled Where Do We Go From Here, expresses a version of his call to action. He asks the reader to evaluate the self and one's potential, which foreshadows the first step of nonviolent direct action, of acknowledging and evaluating the situation as it exists. The second step of negotiations is alluded to in his message of greater diversity of engagement. He goes on to state that we will take direct action against injustice without waiting for other agencies to act. We will not obey unjust laws or submit to unjust prejudices. We will do this peacefully, openly, cheerfully, because our aim is to persuade. This suggests the implementation of self-purification and direct action. King's 1964 book, Why We Can't Wait, includes his letter from Birmingham jail and assesses the U.S. government's slow progress in ensuring the rights of the people. He recalls how volunteers, including local school children, were prepared for direct action. The court of public opinion, which was so important to the success of King's work, was horrified by what was portrayed in the media, and this forced Birmingham's leaders back to the negotiation table. The last call to action examined is King's 1967 speech, A Time to Break Silence. It was perhaps his most scathing critique of the United States government, and it revealed a connection between world events and the plight of African Americans. He demonstrates his overview of the problem in his opening statements. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. He also attempts to show that compassion and nonviolence should be the model of interaction used with all people, which he had attempted to demonstrate through his own successes with nonviolence in the past. His call to action asked for a ceasefire and withdrawal of troops in Vietnam, along with the prevention of future battlegrounds in Southeast Asia. These terms are not met. King suggests the use of direct action techniques such as conscientious objection. This message demonstrates how his call to action has expanded to include a broader focus beyond a regional or national issue. We have the luxury of knowing a great deal about King's intellectual development and how he formulated his call to action. But what if King's writings had been suppressed? Even at the height of the FBI's persecution of him, King was still free to share his views with the rest of America. This same cannot be said for Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. Ranbir Singh Sadhu reports that Indians who kept copies of Bhindranwale's speeches feared arrest as suspected terrorists. Most of the extant works from Bhindranwale come from transcripts made of speeches he delivered during the last few years of his life. Very little has been written about Bhindranwale for an audience outside the Sikh Punjabi community, so let's cover some background here. Young Jarnail had an affinity for religion at an early age, taking Amrit while still very young, and remaining committed to the faith from that point on. 10 years before his death in 1974, Jarnail Singh was awaiting the birth of his second son, Indrajit. Like King, he spent much of his time away from home, traveling and preaching. And although he was popular, he may have lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity, had it not been for a car accident that claimed the life of Kartar Singh Bhindranwale, the leader of a prestigious Sikh school of theology that Jarnail attended, known as the Damdami Taksal. On August 25, 1977, Jarnail Singh was officially named successor, and he became Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. Bhindranwale was exposed to the teachings of Gandhi, like King, but was most likely influenced by a very different side of the barrister from Gujarat to what King and others in the West saw. To many Sikhs, Gandhi was the man who tricked them into remaining in solidarity with India during the partition of 1947, then tried to pressure their assimilation into Hindu culture. The post-partition rise of the Indian National Congress also saw an increase in the persecution of Sikhs, and much of Bhindranwale's call to action was based upon his response to this persecution. This led to his support of the Anandpur Sahib resolution, which called for a semi-autonomous state for the Sikhs of the Punjab, more control over their own resources, and greater respect for them as a people. It was not a call for the formation of a separate Sikh nation known as Khalistan, as some have interpreted, but Bhindranwale said that he wouldn't reject such an offer. "We shall not repeat the same mistake of 1947, he said. The biggest influence upon Bhindranwale's call to action was his connection to his religion. Martyrdom in the Sikh religion has played a major role in its development, just as it has in Christianity. Yet Sikhs did not turn the other cheek. Instead, they came to value self-defense as the best response to violent action. It is within this context that Bhindranwale grew up and formulated his sense of right and wrong. He believed in nonviolence, but was not opposed to taking up the sword when necessary. Bhindranwale's call to action reveals similarities as well as contrasts to the four-step process advocated by King, which is evident in the way that Bhindranwale handled a conflict that arose between Orthodox Sikhs and the followers of the Nirankari sect of Sikhism in 1978. This sect followed a living guru instead of the teachings of the Guru Granth Sahib as their highest authority. In April 1978, the Nirankaris planned an event near the Golden Temple, and Orthodox Sikhs, like Bhindranwale, found this disrespectful. Bhindranwale tried to convince the Nirankaris to gather elsewhere, but when this request was denied, he organized 25 members of the Damdami Taksal and 100 members of another Orthodox Sikh group to protest the Nirankari event. Tempers flared and fighting began. Accounts of who actually started the violent confrontation differ between sources, but in the end, 13 Orthodox Sikhs and 3 Nirankaris were dead. How does this compare to King's methods? For example, Bhindranwale attempts to verify information, negotiate, and protest as a form of direct action. What seems to be missing from Bhindranwale's plan, however, is King's third step, self-purification. Bhindranwale was angry with the Nirankaris because he felt that they were being disrespectful, and that anger motivated his protests. He also did not prepare his followers or those who marched with him in the ways of self-purification. They entered into the confrontation full of anger and ready to react. Bhindranwale partnered with a Sikh political group known as the Akali Dal in a nonviolent direct action campaign called the Dharam Yudh Morcha in 1982. The main goal of the action was to bring more attention to the Anandpur Sahib resolution. Thousands of Sikhs offered themselves up for arrest, but this did not bring the Indian government back to the table of negotiation. Instead, it gave the government the excuse it needed to label Sikhs as terrorists and increase the state-sponsored attacks against them. There would be no creative tension of which King spoke of. Any anti-Sikh oppression would be portrayed as warranted acts of counterterrorism. The last days of Bhindranwale were spent in the Golden Temple, where several attempts were made on his life. Even though he was cornered, he reminded his followers that they should take no violent action against unless they or their temple were at risk. Bhindranwale gave a speech to his fellow Sikhs just a month before his death in May of 1984, stating, "Don't be the first to hurt anyone. We do not have any personal enmity against the Hindus, but if the government of the Hindu rulers make it their goal that the religious temple has to be destroyed and the Sikhs have to be finished off, then there is no need for unity. That day you should strike with your conduct." In June, Indira Gandhi gave the order for Operation Blue Star, which would forcibly remove Bhindranwale and his followers from the Golden Temple. The Indian government shut off transportation in and out of the Punjab, journalists were asked to leave, and telephone lines to the Golden Temple complex were cut. By June 5th, the Golden Temple was under full attack by the Indian government. Bhindranwale is believed to have died in the battle on June 6th, and his body was identified and hastily cremated. Those innocent Sikhs who had come to the Golden Temple to pay their respects to the memory of Guru Arjan were also martyred along with Bhindranwale. Reports vary as to how many lives were lost, but a 2014 British investigation reveals that the number could be as high as 3,000. The final 10 years of the lives of King and Bhindranwale reveal much about their calls to action. In summing up the analysis of their work, some of the observed parallels include that there was an early introduction into the faith for both King and Bhindranwale, and their faith significantly influenced the development of their respective calls to action. Both at least made the attempt to use nonviolence in their work, and each faced government resistance to their calls to action. Some observed differences between the two men include their respective cultural backgrounds, which weighed heavily in the development of their calls to action. King valued integration and nonviolence even to the point of risking life and limb. Bhindranwale, however, sought to maintain a distinct and separate religious freedom and was not opposed to fighting back against an oppressor, if necessary. Both men found models for this behavior in the religious and historic figures from their own cultures. King and Bhindranwale were fairly consistent in their implementation of the problem-solving and negotiation stages of conflict resolution, but they differed in their execution of self-purification and direct action. King was committed to self-purification and nonviolence, but Bhindranwale and his followers were not. King knew that it was essential to have the court of public opinion bear witness to the social inequities that he brought to light. However, Bhindranwale lived within the constraints of a government that suppressed his call to action and the plight of his people. To conclude, I would like to say that comparing the calls to action of these two men demonstrate that no single approach to conflict resolution is universally successful. King's call to action was effective within a particular place and time, but it is unlikely that it would have worked for Bhindranwale because the culture and circumstances of his situation were very different. Yet we cannot judge one behavior as right and another one as wrong without first learning about the cultures that contributed to those behaviors. This helps us not only in our studies of the legendary leaders of the past, but also in our evaluation of future calls to action. And I believe I might have just a little bit of time.
5 minutes.
Since I have a little bit of time left, I wanted to talk to you about some of the images. This is something that was in my larger paper, And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the visual legacy of these two individuals. I had the opportunity to go to London this past summer, and one of the images up top here that you'll see is of Westminster Abbey. Even though this church was built in 960 AD, there is, and I know it's hard to see here, but if you look at the top here, there's a row of 10 martyrs from the 20th century that were actually added there in 1998. And King is actually included in that. So this just goes to show you the international extent of King's message, how he's even included at Westminster Abbey. And if you can look closer on that, you can see that his hand is pointed up towards God. His hand is also stretched out in a gesture of charity, which is also consistent with the message of King, which is along with his legacy. At his feet, you'll also see a child, and that is also consistent with his legacy because of the Children's Crusade and also the 16th Street Baptist Church of Children that were killed there. So that is consistent with the message there. Also, I wanted to show you something from my hometown, a couple things from my hometown over here. This is the Martin Luther King Bridge that goes into downtown Fort Wayne, and it was actually built just outside of the downtown area. So as you're going into Fort Wayne, you will see this as you're going into the town itself. So it is the gateway into the major part of the city. And flanked on either side are images of King. And all along the bridge, you will see the words of King carved into the stone and the steel of the bridge. So as someone walks over this bridge, you're actually interacting physically with the words of King. And this is a bridge that was also built in an area that floods on a regular occasion. It's flooding right now as we're talking. But we've had several floods in the Fort Wayne area. So this was an area where the flooding is taking place all the time. So King is sort of standing guard and standing as the sentinel protecting the people of Fort Wayne. He's standing at that spot. And also it is lit up in the evenings with multicolored lights, which also goes along with his message of reaching all people of all different colors. So that also goes along very well with the message of King. Many of you have probably heard about the controversies with the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C., about how they truncated his message, and also it had to be redone, but also there was some other controversies as well. Some people had criticized it because it was made by a Chinese sculptor, and they said that a person from the United States, an African American, should have sculpted this. But I want to get maybe a gauge of, I know people here probably have a different idea on that. What do you think about that? Do you think it should have been African American, or do you think it could have been a Chinese individual?
Should have been African American.
Okay. What do you say?
Well, I think he would have, honored who he is and what he stood for and purpose.
Okay, okay. Anybody else?
I think it's okay if it's Chinese, because I think his message is beyond just one race, specific race, or one specific group of people. And he belongs to everybody and every culture.
Right, and that was one of the things that came up in the discussion on that, is he does belong to all different cultures. And one of the things with the Westminster Abbey as well, he also belongs to all different cultures, not just American culture, not just African American culture, but he also belongs to the European culture as well. In fact, he spoke in St. Paul's Cathedral, which is not the same cathedral, but he spoke there, and they also have a very large Martin Luther King celebration every year there. So I thought that was very interesting. So we've talked about King. Let's talk about Benjamin Walley. I know that you've had just a little taste of Benjamin Walley, some of you, but let's take a look at some of these images here. Some of them actually come from Gurdwaras, and some of them come from the internet. Let me talk to you just about a couple of them here. This particular one comes from the Gurdwara in Fort Wayne. It's called the Dashmesh Sikh Gurdwara. And what it basically says on the top there is, He lived bravely, and he died with his religion. And the Bonapartes says that Bhindranwale was a great Sikh and a great martyr of the 20th century. So what we also see here is the use of the colors blue and orange, which are colors that are significant to the Sikh religion. The blue tends to be representative of seva, which is selfless service, and the orange is representative of martyrs. So do you think that one is a good representation of him? You think that works? I think it does, and also the placement of it is in a Gurdwara in the Langar Hall, where it's the community hall where people come to eat. The one problem that we see, though, is that no one else sees this. These other monuments to Martin Luther King, those are out in the open. But who sees the images of Bhindranwale? They're at the Gurdwara, where people speak Punjabi. They've already heard the story, many of them have. But how about the rest of us? Those images need to be out there, and also they need to be translated from Punjabi into English, or other languages, wherever they're placed. Also, here's another one here I want you to take a look at. You notice the name on the side, Khalistan. I mentioned briefly Khalistan in my presentation. Khalistan is the separate Sikh homeland that was proposed. But he didn't specifically state that he wanted Khalistan. He wanted the rights of his people. So, but this is really, since the death of Bhindranwale, he has become a symbol of Khalistan. And you'll see that on the internet, that people tend to focus in on him as the face of Khalistan. But that's not really accurate, because he didn't call for Khalistan. He actually called for the rights of his people. And also here, we'll take a look at, this is also from South Hall. This is from the largest Gurdwara outside of India. And this is another image of Bhindranwale as well, inside the Langar Hall, but again, not where people out can see it and out in the public. This one's a little bit more public. This is in Toronto, but again, outside of Gurdwara, where people can't really interact with it unless they are going to the Gurdwara. And also, look at the placement of it. This is in an area where you're driving into the Gurdwara, so it's in an archway. Notice the placement of it above everything. Do you think Bhindranwale would have wanted that? No? You said no. Bhindranwale probably would not have wanted this because what he considered the highest authority was the Guru Granth Sahib. That's the holy book of the religion. That's his highest authority. After that, he would probably say the gurus, the 10 gurus of the religion. He would not have probably wanted something like this for himself. Are you good?
Yeah, no, we're good. So let's...
Thank you so much.
So, time now for questions and interaction with Lori.
I have a question. Okay. I was just regarding it last night. Are the other 10 gurus, are they placed like that in any of the inmate communities?
Usually when you see placement of the gurus, sometimes see them in the Divan Hall, which is the worship hall where people go in and actually worship. You would see them in the Langar Halls as well. I have seen them there. In this particular Gurdwara in Fort Wayne, they don't have anyone from the 10 gurus. They just have him, which is interesting. It's a good point. And also at South Hall, they do have some images of the different gurus. I know that they had Guru Gobind Singh for sure. Like, he's the 10th guru. But I didn't see a whole lot of representation of the other gurus. But I just find it interesting, so interesting that he's placed so prominently in the Langar Hall where people come together to eat. And it is something that's reinforced into the Punjabi population over and over again. This is an ideal for us, which is, it has good and bad connotations, I think. Did you have a question?
I did have a question. I mean, I thought, you know, your point that, well, first, thank you for your presentation. I learned a ton about something I know absolutely nothing about, so I'm totally curious and interested. So I thought your point about, you know, kind of freedom of speech issues and access to,
exactly.
you know, media, to the press. I thought that was a really, you know, interesting point in your comparison. And, you know, the effect that suppression of voice would have on Benjawali. And I wondered about, you know, like currently in Indian culture, because I don't know anything about this, you know, do you think that there's still a suppression of that voice and a suppression of the legacy? So it's not even something that we, that would, you know, as a historical legacy where we sort of reclaim, you know, martyrs who we learn about and their story becomes public. Do you think that there's still that level of suppression that would not allow that to even come to the forefront?
There is, and suppression specifically of Bhindranwale. There have been some folk songs that have been written about him that have been banned in India, even to this day. There are some people who are trying to bring these things to light, but most of them have had to leave India to actually tell their story. And in fact, Sandhu, who wrote, or he has the book that I showed in the presentation, got most of his information from people who smuggled that information out from India. They went to either USA or Canada. They had copies of those tapes, and he was able to make transcriptions of them. If you want to learn more about it, there is a group called ENSAF, ENSAAF.org, and it means justice, and it's all about how people are still disappearing in India. The Sikhs are still disappearing in India. The people who choose to wear their articles of faith, like the turbans, the kirpans, keep their hair, those sorts of things, are still being attacked, are still being kidnapped, and they disappear. What's really sad about this is a lot of times when you will have a death, God forbid there should be more deaths in this country with the house of worship, but you have a body and something happens. What usually happens when these fake police encounters take place is that the bodies are burned, because that is the predominant way of disposing of a body in Hindu culture and in Sikh culture. So the body is gone. Where's your forensic evidence on that? We don't know. We don't really know how that person died. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have accurate counts on what happened in 1984, because those bodies were burned up, and we don't really know how many people were burned up in that.
You know, as you know, my neighborhood is predominantly Indian. I mean, it's a lot. It's a large population. But I find that the Sikhs tend to keep to themselves and tend to culturally be private.
Right.
And in fact, Lori took me to Guadalajara in my neighborhood, and they were very warm and friendly and embraced us, you know, these strange white people and black people rolling up in there. But they were they were wonderful, actually. But I'm wondering if some of that, like where you said the freedom of speech, is their voice being suppressed, or is it culturally that they're not as open about their culture and their issues and their needs as maybe King would have been?
Well, I do think that certain people who have had the opportunity to say something have been suppressed, so that definitely looms in their minds, and I think that looms in the minds of a lot of people who are immigrants, that they came from oppression, and so they're not sure what they can say and do in this country. And I think that's what's also happening with the Sikh population here. But I do tend to see that what is happening is they will place the gurdwaras in maybe an outskirts area. Now yours is in a pretty prominent area, but ours are in pretty out in the boonies. So people don't necessarily know where they're at.
And ours would be considered out in the boonies too. It's just that our community is being built up, and so like my community's like 6 years old, and there was nothing around there, so it probably followed suit that it was out in the boonies. But I noticed, just as a group, you know, they don't really communicate with everybody else in the neighborhood. And I found that it wasn't because they were unfriendly, you know, as I found with you when we were interacting, but that's why I'm asking the question about culturally, do they tend to keep to themselves?
And I can probably call on some of my family members who've all been to the Gurdwara, that sometimes they do tend to keep to themselves a little bit because they just don't know how to communicate. That's another problem, is that we aren't reaching the adults that are coming into the community. That's one of the things that I've talked about with our Department of Justice, getting some training for the people in our community in particular, not just the Sikhs, but also the Burmese and also some of our Muslim community members. We have training in place for the younger kids that are coming up through the schools, but what are we doing for the adults that are coming in? Because I know when I met with the Burmese folks, they had told me that they were not getting the jobs that they wanted to get. They were not getting promoted because of their English skills. And I think that we're not addressing some of those issues to allow people to really advance.
Laura, I just wonder, where do you place yourself in this work? So where does that come from for you?
As far as like how I got involved with the Sikh community, that's
right, and yeah, and you're interested in this. So yeah, so where did it come from to say, hey, let me do this?
Okay, well, I'll tell you that for a while I had been involved with Indian culture, and in particular the Sikh community. I had been involved with the Gurdwaras, and people were telling me about some of the problems that they were having in this country, some of the stereotypes that were being put out about them, and some of the problems that their children were having. That made me want to get involved with the Sikh Coalition, which is an organization that anybody can get involved with, but it's basically deals with the human rights violations that are addressed as far as Sikh issues, such as being targeted in airports, being bullied in schools, employment issues. For example, the people that want to go into the military cannot go into the military because of the beard and the turban. There are a few people who have been in there prior to this, but as of about 1980, they said no more. So if you want to join the military, if you want to serve your country, which Seva is a big part of the Sikh religion, it's one of the things that they hold most dear. They want to serve our country, but they can't because they have to give up their religion. If you're a person who has taken Amrit, you're asked to keep your beard and you're asked to keep your hair, and usually the men will keep their hair in a turban. So if they have to make that choice, they're not going to go against their religion. So, but they want to, and this is something that is an ongoing thing. You'll see, if you go up on the Sikh Coalition's website, you will see some of the work that they've done. Major Khalsi is one of the few people who has had an exception made, and he has been serving honorably. He served in Afghanistan. He actually saved 2 lives, brought them back from the dead on the table. So they've served honorably, and in fact, Bhagat Singh Thind in World War I actually served wearing the turban as well. He was a member of the United States military. They've served all over the world with beards and turbans. For some reason, they can't hear.
So I remember Doug's question was, how did you come to be committed enough or interested enough to
For
research?
Bhindranwale in particular, right? Okay. Well, learning about the Sikh religion, I started looking into different parts of the culture, and I kept seeing, remember 84, remember 84, remember 84. And I said, what is this 84 situation? And I started looking into it, and I found out what happened in 84. And I found out who Bhindranwale was. But no, I was alive in 1984. And I'm sure everybody else in this room has been live in 1984, but we didn't learn about those things in this country. And the reason why is because of that suppression of that story. The story that we got was that they put down this rebel faction. So we didn't learn about what really happened. And we didn't really learn about it until the few people who were able to escape and come to this country or come to Canada. A lot of them come to Australia as well, have been able to come and tell their story. But a lot of them will not talk about it too, because of the idea of Charikala, is a perpetual optimism. That's also something that's part of the religion too, that they don't necessarily want to dwell on the negative in their lives. We're going forward, moving positive ahead. That's what Charikala is. So maybe they won't talk about 1984 until you directly ask them what happened in 1984. Some of them actually lived through it. I know people who lived through it and they, oh well, that was a bad time. But they don't necessarily want to get into that too much.
Lori, would you talk a little bit about how you see elements of this project influencing or becoming part of, if they are, your future work as you go into your dissertation?
Yes. The work that I intend on doing is looking at martyrdom and suffering in the Sikh religion as it is expressed in artwork. And so some of the work that you saw with Bhindranwale would be included in that. But if you look at the history of the Sikh religion, almost from the beginning, you see incidents of martyrdom. Guru Arjan was actually the first martyr of the Sikh religion. So from that point on, we start to see incidents of where they've been attacked, and the images of that are very important in the expression of the faith to the next generation. They use these images to teach the children about what's going on. And there have been movies made as well. There are public artworks that are made that are dedicated to these sorts of things. So this is what I'm hoping to work on in my dissertation.
Lori, again, I just echo the thanks for your presentation. So I'm curious to know, I want to take it a step further. I want to know, maybe others too, I want to know your thoughts about martyrdom. When did you first come in contact with it? Do you have any personal or educational or relational experiences with martyrdom? How do you see that playing out in your work?
As me being a martyr myself?
Or know of anyone close to you who may have been a martyr, or just some type of contact with martyrdom. And how do you see that playing out in your work? Do you see yourself becoming one? Do you see yourself influencing future martyrs, or what?
Well, I hope I don't influence any future martyrs. I would say that it's a really good question. I think that people who have lived a certain lifestyle, who have maybe not had everything at their disposal, have lived a life of martyrdom already, and maybe not in the way that someone who's actually died for a cause has, but people who maybe come, and we're talking about, say, for example, King's version of martyrdom. People who put themselves on the line every day as an activist are a form of martyr too. And the things that they do in their lives, the sacrifices that they make, that's all part of that martyrdom. They don't necessarily have to die. And in fact, the idea of the shaheed, which is the term that's often used for a Sikh martyr, that can be also a person who has sacrificed something for the cause. So as far as things that I personally have done to sacrifice for the cause, you know, this has not been a popular thing for me in my community to necessarily go this route, and it's not been a popular thing in a lot of different situations. Just through the evolution of what I have done here at Union has not been a popular thing from where I come from. So that has, I think that is part of the martyrdom, but you have to do those things in order to move forward. You move society forward that way. I hope that answers your question.
No, I appreciate that.
It was a great presentation, and certainly could see that's very much a part of your commitment to activism. And I first became aware of how Sikhs are persecuted, a couple of years ago with the incident in the temple in Wisconsin. But what I really appreciate about your snippet of your presentation was when you began to unpack this mystique about Gandhi, this great human rights activist.
Right.
And actuality, he was not necessarily the way we had painted him to be.
Yeah. Gandhi has his good and his bad. Martin Luther King has his good and his bad. Bindranwale has his good and his bad. One of the things that I appreciated so much about doing this project, and also in Dr. Burns' class before this, is how we learned about the humanity of these people. They're not perfect. They did some things extraordinarily well, but they also had some really messed up problems too. And I think if we can see how they did it, with all the things that they had going on with their lives, maybe we can make a difference too.
Thank you for your presentation, but I wanted to ask a question. Can you talk a little bit about the perspective of violence in their community? I was just curious because, you focused on the fact that Dr. King did, focused on peaceful protests, but I was just wondering what the context of, how they see, violence in Bindranwale community.
The Sikh view of violence.
Yes.
Yeah. And definitely, like I said, not necessarily going to turn the other cheek if someone wrongs them. This is actually something that has been taught to them. I might have it on the handout, the Guru Hargobind, who was the son of Guru Arjan. He actually started to teach his people that you need to start defending yourselves. We're not going to let this happen to us again, because Guru Arjan was actually tortured to death by the Mughal emperor. So he did not want that to happen to anyone ever again. So he taught them how to defend themselves. But he also taught them that we're not going to go out and be aggressive. We're not going to be on the offensive here. We